So, these are going to be the best decks post the nerf, and all these decks are not set in stone. They have tech cards that I've personally put in that I've had success with. However, you can look all of these decks up on Hearthstone Replay or on Hearthstone top decks if you want different builds, but these are the ones that in general will have the most success. So the first one is Stealth Rogue. The reason why this is number one, even though it's probably not like the number one deck on any list, is because of the fact that it's on every single list. It's top tier at pretty much every level of play, where most decks, even like Libram Paladin, fall off and go from like the very top of tier 1 to like top-ish to middle pack of the tier 2 category. Stealth Rogue is pretty much tier 1 at every single level of play. So because of its consistency and the fact that it's probably the best aggro deck out there right now, I'd say that it deserves the spot of the number one deck. It also has some cool little tech things that you can do, and it also has the Secret Passage, which after all of the nerfs, I believe is the most powerful card in the game, standalone card. And the fact that you have the 2-mana sap that gets rid of buff cards from Paladin and taunt minions that can allow you to go face, which also helps against Druid to some extent. And overall, it's just a really, really, really good deck. I would highly recommend playing it if you haven't already. It's not that expensive. If you don't have the Infiltrator Liliana or even Edwin, you could probably put in a card like, a card that I actually personally might want to put in is Shifty Sophomore. So if you don't have Edwin or Infiltrator Liliana, you could put in a Shifty Sophomore. You have multiple ways of triggering the Spell Burst, and I've actually seen a couple of people run this card, and it's been fairly successful. So if you want to try it out, go ahead. This is a good potential card if you're on a budget. And yeah, this is the number one deck in the game, in my opinion. So let's jump into the next one. So number 2 on this list is Libram Paladin, and let me explain why it's not number 1 real quick, and there are 2 reasons. One, it's not top tier. It's middle of tier 2 at the highest levels of play, which means that, this is number 2, there's some clear counterplay that can be exploited. That means you can win more against it, and it'll lose a few more games if people learn to exploit that. But however, before I jump into this, let me just tell you that this is an absolutely phenomenal deck, and it's still number 2 because as long as you're not in Legend currently, and even in Legend it does fine, by the way, it's still a tier 2, top-ish of tier 2 level deck, so it's still very good. Unless you're at the highest levels of play, people don't know how to utilize these counters, but the 2 counters are just generate tempo on the board, because Paladin has no way of coming back into the game. The only way they have is maybe a good Consecrate, which you only run 1 of. Some people run 2, some people run 0 actually, but I would say at least run 1 just in case you play against something aggro. And 2, the fact that they're pretty easy to counter. You just have to kill off their minions before they pump them, or if you're Priest or something that can kill off a big minion or stall out a big minion, let's say Sap for Rogue, you just let them pump up their things and kill off a lot of stats with 1 small card and then regain the board after that. So, also, Paladin has no draw, so if they do lose control, once again, not only is it hard for them to come back, but they also can't really draw their way back into the game. But all that being said, it sounds very negative. This deck is really, really, really strong, and if they're not able to do anything about it, and you have a turn 1 play, you're borderline unstoppable. Like, this deck snowballs super hard, especially if they don't have the on-turn removal. So, I would recommend this deck highly. It's pretty easy to play. Just play tempo, pump things up, and try to steamroll them. And yeah, it's a good deck. I would highly recommend it despite all of the negative things I said. I'm just trying to tell you how to beat it because it is a very difficult deck to beat, especially at lower ranks when people don't know exactly what to do. So number 3 on this list is Galacron Warrior, or Bomb Warrior, depending on what you want to call it. And it's up here at number 3 for 2 reasons. There's a positive and a negative. One, in its prime, because there's a broad spectrum as to how well this deck can do, in its prime, in its like ideal meta, this is the best deck in the game, by far. It has insane board wipe. It has great, like, board control, rather. It has some pretty powerful minions and stuff. You gain in a lot of armor, so that way you can kill things with your weapon or just go face. And then you have good late game to compete with a lot of those control decks. The reason why this deck isn't number 1, though, is because the clear counterplay is just run Acidic Swampoos or Kobold Sticky Fingers. Like, if you watch me play any of the games with my mid-range or slower decks that aren't pure aggro, yeah, I just destroy or steal their weapon after they upgrade it, and literally 1 or 2 of them have just conceded, and then the other ones have tried to play it out. But if you take a Wrench Caliber that was just upgraded, which makes it a 4/2 weapon after they attack with it, obviously, if you steal that with Kobold Sticky Fingers, their entire win condition is gone. Or if you just destroy it with Acidic Swampoos and play something else afterwards, their win condition is gone, right? So because there's a high risk with this deck, if people change their meta to play around weapons, This deck is only number 3 because there's clear counterplay. That being said, weapons aren't super prominent in the meta right now. There aren't a lot of Dragon Hunters. There aren't a lot of weapons in any of the other decks right now. Dragon Hunter was the other deck that I usually used it for. And because of that, I think that this deck still is a top tier deck. That being said, I will look at this deck every single week to see if I see more Acidic Swampoos and Kobold Sticky Fingers. And if there are more, I will probably move this deck down. But until then, this deck will remain a top 3 deck. Okay, so the next deck on this list is Tempo Demon Hunter. Now, people in my chat have asked me if this is as good as on-release Tempo Demon Hunter. The answer is no. On-release Tempo Demon Hunter needed to be hotfixed. It had a 63% win rate on release and had some of the was probably the most broken a class has ever been in the history of Hearthstone and should ever be. That being said, though, this deck is still really, really strong. And it's strong because of a couple of additions. Voracious Reader, giving you 3 card draw when you have almost half of your deck being 1-drops is really good. You basically just keep all of your 1-drops, you play a 1-drop, coin out another, then you play one and hero power the next turn, and then eventually play one more and play Voracious Reader, and then you draw like 2 or 3 cards, and you're chilling. Not only that, but you could potentially have some of this late game stuff to actually close out games. The amount of closeout potential with this deck is crazy. Marrow Slicer on turn 4 is 4 damage, and then again is 9 on turn 5. Like, this is 9 extra damage on turn 5. Glaive-Bound Adept does extra, which means that if you play this turn 4, hit twice, and play this right here is 13 damage over the course of 2 turns, not including the early tempo, or the fact that you also have a 6-4 on the board. Then you have good draw with Skull Gul'dan and Voracious Reader. You have Mage Hunter, which can kill off all the buffed minions. Everything about this deck screams success. This is going to be a very good deck. I've seen it been rising in the meta a little bit, especially with the Demon Hunter, or not the Demon Hunter, the Druid nerf, which basically just kind of decimated this deck a lot. They basically just get out a big taunt minion or a rush minion with Cleave and shut this deck down because it has very little direct damage. With that deck going because of the nerf to Kael'thas, which actually did a lot more than I thought, this deck has been rising in the meta, and I think will continue to rise and may rival Rogue as the best aggro deck. As of right now, it's still Stealth Rogue, but in the future, it will be close. I'm just putting it at 4 for right now because I'm not super experienced with this deck quite yet. But let's move on to number 5. Okay, so the next deck on this list, number 5, is Highlander Hunter, and it's basically on this list for the same reason it was on pretty much every single list last expansion. Obviously, the expansion has changed, and for a little bit of a time, there was a bit of a dip. Obviously, there were things like Druid running rampant, which kind of destroyed this deck a little bit because they'd get out huge things that you weren't able to deal with unless you had Zephyrus, and you'd lose control of the board and you wouldn't be able to recover. That being said, though, the meta stabilized a little bit. People have figured out how to counter certain things. People have understood where the meta has gone. And just the raw power of this deck alone, with every single turn having some of the most mana-efficient cards in the game just existing, has caused this deck to once again rise in the meta. I think that this deck is a top 5 deck. Don't necessarily think it's as strong as some of the other decks on this list, obviously, because it's at the number 5 spot. But I think it deserves some respect and recognition. Running Acidic Swampoos to counter Bomb Warrior is extremely helpful, along with it also countering some Paladin and some other Hunter decks if you happen to play against them. And just so you know, this is the version without Alexstrasza, Nagrand Slam, Siamat, or any of those other big things. It basically relies all on the turn 1, 2, and 3 play, and then having a couple of big mid-game spikes with Dragonbane and Evasive Feywing being absolutely insane on curve plays. Faceless Corruptor and Rottenness Drake regaining control of the board sometimes if you lose control. Varanus being insane board wipe, and then Dino Tamer Bran basically closing out any game you could ever hope to close out. Like, this deck is actually still really good. I would highly recommend trying it out. And if you don't have the dust, I can try to come out with a budget version. But I can't make any promises about that. Although, I do think that this deck, if you run a more beast-oriented build, could actually be run on a budget, because I think there's some pretty cool beasts. So that's just an idea I'm throwing out there. If you don't have Rottenness Drake or any of the legendaries, you could throw in some extra, maybe rush minions for Diving Griffin, and some extra beast minions, just so you have beast synergy and good minions on curve. So anyway, this deck is really good. I would highly recommend it. Let's jump into the next one. So the next deck on this list is Galacron Priest, and it's very, very good for a couple of reasons, but I'm going to talk about why it's bad real quick and why it's not higher. And the bad reason is, I feel like it just loses to hard aggro decks. I think that if you're playing as a Tempo Demon Hunter or a Face Hunter, unless you have Apotheosis, which this deck doesn't run, by the way, or you're playing against a Stealth Rogue, this deck will just get blown out. And those decks are fairly popular. Also, Paladin to some extent, if you can't get the single target removal you absolutely need. Because me running Shadow Word Death is literally to counter those decks. Normally, these cards are Holy Smite, which means that you're not going to have as good and consistent removal. But if you want to run this card, go ahead. This is the deck that will be in the description. That being said, though, this deck has unparalleled value. This deck is insane. It's so strong if they don't close out the game within the first 7 turns. After that, you just invoke, you can play Galacron to kill stuff and generate so many resources you just can't lose, which means that it definitely deserves to be on this list. It's just a very slow deck that not a lot of people like to play, and it's moderately expensive, although if you don't want to run another Soul Mirror, you can maybe run another Shadow Word Ruin, or Breath of the Infinite, depending on what matchups you're playing against. Murazond, you could run another Breath of the Infinite or Shadow Word Ruin to help you control the board that way. And Galakrond is needed, obviously. Kronx is fairly needed. And Headmaster, you could probably take out for another tempo-based card, or Apotheosis to help you in aggro. In fact, instead of Murazond, if you run 1 Breath of the Infinite, don't run a Shadow Word Ruin, just run 2 Apotheoses if you're missing 1, 2, 3 legendaries. Just go 1, 2, 3, 1 Breath of the Infinite, 2 Apotheoses, and that'll basically cover your biggest weaknesses of the deck. I do think these cards are still better, but those are valuable replacements that'll make the deck pretty decent all around. So, hope you guys enjoy. Wait, there's still one more deck. Hold up, 1 second. This one's more of a personal preference deck, so take this one with a grain of salt. It's just a deck that I've personally had great success with, and I'd like to throw it on here because I think it deserves more respect than it currently gets. So the last 2 decks on this list are honorable mentions, and I kind of combine them into number 7 because they basically function the same purpose. It's basically just really budget, aggro-based decks that are easy to play, can snowball super hard, and don't require too much dust or money to put in order to create them. First one is Totem Shaman. I've loved this deck for a very long time, and it has some of the best, if not the best, snowball potential in the game, other than maybe Paladin. But this deck can pump up more than just one thing, and if the opponent doesn't have a response turn 1, a lot of the time, you can just win. You just win. You play Trick Totem or Evil Totem or even just a normal Totem turn 2. And if they didn't have a turn 1 play, to kill off the Totem immediately. And then they play something turn 2. If you follow up with a Totemic Reflection, the game is done. You win, for the most part. And then maybe a Splitting Axe. Totem Goliath gives you good mid-game where you can close it out with a Bloodlust or another Totemic Reflection or Totemic Surge. Or even Storm's Wrath or Totem Might. Like, you have so many things that buff up your board to where as long as you can get the ball rolling even just a little bit and duplicate your stuff, it just becomes this snowballing effect that wins you the game. The attack isn't high enough for things like Shadow Word Ruin to kill things off, but the health is high enough to survive a lot of the 2 damage removal, like Holy Nova, like Breath of the Infinite, Consecrate, and you can actually stagger the health as well because you'll buff the totems, but also have like little 1/1 and 2/1 and 1/2 minions on the board, which will actually inherently protect your totems from being board wiped from Blade Storm. And this guy's got a big death rattle, so if you get brawled, you get a big board at the end of the day anyway. This deck is just really good. And then the other honorable mention that's very similar to this one is actually just Face Hunter. I've been playing this deck a decent amount. I think I'm 6-3 with it. It's very, very fast. It snowballs extremely hard. It's got pretty much nothing past turn 4 other than a Dragonbane. Voracious Reader is the saving grace of this deck. With this card being released, the deck is actually super duper viable. And it can rush down a lot of the decks in the meta right now. Druid is a lot less popular, which used to beat up on this deck because you had no response to the big minions. In fact, I took out Pressure Plate because that used to be how you countered Druid. But Explosive Trap deals with, again, Demon Hunter and Rogue better, which I think are top tier decks that are rising in popularity. There's limited healing, so you're able to just out-damage them and then just burst them down with maybe a Kill Command or a Hero Power or something. And overall, this deck is really, really strong. I would highly recommend playing either one of these decks. They're great on a budget. If you don't have a Dragonbane, just run another Unleash the Hounds. And neither of these decks really require legendaries at all. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. This video is I love making these kind of videos. If you want more information, please tell me in the comments below. I'll do what I can to help you guys out. And I will be keeping my eye on these decks and try to come out with the tier list every single week for you guys so you know what's up in the meta. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.